Now I'd like to move on to our keynote presentation. I'm going to introduce Brendan LaCerda, who's the senior economist at Moody's Analytics. Ryan Sweet, who was supposed to join us this morning, unfortunately was in a bad car accident the other day. I want to report he's doing well, thank God. We'll keep him in our prayers, but certainly he was not able to be with us today. But let me tell you a little bit about Brendan. Brendan is a senior economist with Moody's Analytics. He serves as the lead analyst for the Canadian Economic Forecast, and his primary responsibilities also include development and improvement of country forecast models. His research is primarily focused on international macroeconomics, healthcare, and fiscal policy. Before joining Moody's, Brendan worked as a senior economist with IHS Global Insights, U.S. Macroeconomic Service. Brendan received his PhD in economics from the University of Virginia, and he pursued his undergraduate education at the London School of Economics and the University of Notre Dame, where he graduated with a BA in economics and mathematics. Let's please welcome Brendan LaCerda.
All right, is this working? All right, great. Yeah, I think if you listen to the last part of that bio, it says I spent way too many years in college. I think 10 years in college, God. Luckily, my parents only had to pay for some of that. Well, we finally did it, folks. We put the R word in the title of our presentation. This makes sense with a lot of recession talk recently. I just heard Michelle talking about your own Outlook survey. 56% of respondents concerned about a recession in the next 2 years. I have a rule of thumb, which is, if CNBC or Bloomberg calls me up and asks about a recession, I'm not that worried. They're probably just looking for clicks or views or, attention. If my mom calls me on Sunday and asks about a recession, that's when I get nervous. That means it's finally sort of permeated through, the media. And she always asks me what stock she should buy. I'm like, I don't do that, Mom. That's not what I do for a living. And as Michelle said, my name is Brendan LaCerda. I'm a senior economist with Moody's Analytics. I would say my job really falls into two categories. The first being model building. So all of the global forecasts that we produce for the United States, Canada, the rest of the world, I work on building those models. So yeah, to some degree, I am a statistics junkie, computer programming. They finally let me out of the office today and, had me come and meet with you folks. And then secondly, I'm the chief economist for Canada at Moody's Analytics. So yes, why did they send the chief economist down here for Canada? Well, one fact, 20% of New Jersey exports go to Canada. #1 destination. Second place, Mexico, 8%. So there's actually a lot of business between New Jersey and Canada. Not that I'll be talking about any of that today, but important to keep in the back of your mind. And before I go any further, I do want to thank the New Jersey Business and Industry Association for inviting me to speak today. I'm very grateful. So as we begin, all this talk about recession, who should we look to in these uncertain times? Well, I look to Teddy Baseball. Baseball is the only field of endeavor where a man can succeed 3 times out of 10 and be considered a good performer. Of course, Teddy's being modest because he holds the single season batting average record of 406 in the modern era. We're not counting the old stuff here. But that's right, we sort of have to think about, I think the point here is to actually think about, why were we wrong? When you think about in the past, okay, my forecast was correct, great, and give myself a pat on the back. The more interesting times are when we get it wrong and figuring out why we got it wrong. Because as I started this discussion saying, I build economic models. So what does that even mean? Basically, I'm laying down sets of equations that, they're just relationships between different variables: unemployment, spending, housing starts, GDP, interest rates, exchange rates. You just look at the historical data, you write down these equations, you estimate them, and you get the correlations, the relationships between these things. If this goes up, this goes down. But this is really just a tool. The question is, you have to, in order to make the whole thing work and produce a forecast, you have to plug in assumptions. So sort of one of the key things I want to focus on today is, what are the assumptions behind our forecast? Because I can put numbers up on the screen, the economy's going to do good, the economy's going to do bad. But sort of where does that come from? And I don't really want to get into like the nitty-gritty of the structure and methodology of the model. It's more important to focus on what are the assumptions that we're plugging in, and then understanding if those assumptions are wrong, how would the forecast be different? So as a matter of fact, every single month, my group, we produce 10 scenarios for the United States. So this huge distribution of forecasts of which direction the economy is going to go. And what we're doing each time is varying the assumptions. What if the trade war goes really bad? What if it goes really, really bad, apocalyptic? What if Brexit turns out to be nothing? What if it turns out to be fine? You change the assumptions and you see how the forecast is going to change. Because there isn't really, there's generally accepted macroeconomic theory. There's generally a lot of agreement on, X causes Y causes Z to happen. So the question is, what can't your model predict? And that's what we call economic shocks. What is going to shock the economy? Could it be one of President Trump's decisions about the trade war? What happens in the next British election? What happens in the leveraged loan market? You have to sort of think about how the economy would naturally evolve in some way, but what's that unknown that could come out of left field, no pun intended, and change how the economy is going to perform. And the way I sort of want to structure this talk is to first lay forth the state of affairs. What's the recent performance of the economy? Given these factors, what's our baseline outlook for how things are headed? Second, I'm going to talk about the risks. We have to admit that the future has some uncertainty. What could go wrong? And then lastly, sort of maybe the most important question is that if things don't go well, how capable is the federal government or the state government to responding to those events? What capacity does monetary policy or fiscal policy have to blunt a downturn in the private sector? So let's start with, we're going to go 40,000 feet, high level global economy, and then we'll try to zoom down and see what's going on in New Jersey. So what we've done here, this is a bit of a subjective judgment, but based on different data and sort of a combined index, we classify all the countries in the global economy into one of four categories. You're expanding, everything's great. You're slowing down, but you're still growing. You're in full-blown recession, or you're coming out of that recession and you're in some recovery phase. Now, if I showed you this chart, if we were having this conference a year ago, virtually every single country is up in the expansion region. And what's happened over the last year is we've seen this deceleration in growth. So the number one fact, what is the number one takeaway you want to get today? The global economy is slowing. Why is that the case? Let's start in Europe. Germany, the UK are on the brink of recession. There's been a number of changes in regulations. Speaking of regulation today, there are a number of regulations put in on Germany's auto industry related to diesel and fuel standards and pollutants and that thing. Germany took a really hard hit. Growth, they're almost on the brink, but about to tip into recession. I think we're more familiar with the situation in the UK. It's hard to remember, the British voted to leave the European Union about 3 years ago. They still haven't left. They still haven't made up their minds. And there's just this gridlock creates this huge amount of uncertainty about which way things are going to go. Investment pulls back. Consumer confidence is really low. The UK is also on the brink of recession, growing very slowly. And then in the context of this, we have to remember that the European Central Bank is just cranking stimulus into the economy, and they still can't get it to grow. They pulled interest rates into negative territory. Now, if that doesn't sound shocking to you, we should probably walk through that for a second and think about how crazy negative interest rates are. You're going to lend me $100 today, and then a year from now, I'll pay you back $99. It's a bit of a weird phenomenon. The German 10-year bond, I looked it up before I walked into the hotel this morning, is trading at negative 0.3%. That is a sign of dysfunction. The interest rates, we think about term premium, discounting future, all these sort of economic things. It's really bizarre. We're sort of in a whole new world that interest rates, nominal interest rates can go negative. We should have some clarity. The UK election is 4 days away. I don't think there'll be much resolution following that. The government's still likely to be splintered. So, the first assumption I'll lay out, what is our assumption about Brexit in our forecast? That they keep kicking the can down the road repeatedly, and then they finally realize it was a terrible idea and they give up on it. That is an optimistic assumption in my mind. It's the consensus at Moody's Analytics. I think it's, a little bit optimistic. So, in terms of the balance of risks, in that, I would say the balance of risk is weighted towards the downside. It's probably more likely than not that things go worse than that assumption. Secondly, we go over to China. The Chinese economy is slowing down significantly. In fact, I think the latest number, 6% GDP growth in China, that's a 27-year low. Exports to the United States down 22% year over year. And China has two problems, essentially. In economics, one thing we refer to is this as the middle income trap. Because if you think about how did China grow? Really cheap labor, manufacturing moved there to take advantage of that, and the economy grew by, expanding exports. Well, over time, the income that, they're getting from exports, standards of living start to rise, wages start to rise, and suddenly, those companies say, China's expensive now. I'm going to go to Vietnam. I'm going to go to Indonesia. I'm going to go to the Philippines. There's sort of always another country out there with cheaper labor, essentially. So that's how countries get stuck in this middle income trap, where suddenly they can't grow by exporting anymore. So what China is trying to do is pivot its economy to something that looks more like the United States, more based on consumption, more based on services, more based on developing its own intellectual property, but truth is, they still steal a lot of IP from the United States. So that's on one hand, and then on the other hand, we have the trade war, which I'll probably talk a lot about today, because it is one of those things, we would admit that we got wrong. And when I say we got wrong, what I'm really saying is the negative effects are worse than we had originally predicted. It's easy to do the bean counting of, tariffs go up 25%. That's going to raise the cost of goods or cost of production this much. That's going to reduce exports, imports this much. The much harder thing to get at is, well, how are these tariffs going to affect sentiment? How are these tariffs going to affect business confidence? What about the uncertainty that they create? Because, as we saw in the survey today, one of the reasons investment is so weak as a result of the trade war is you have to think about, the companies that are hit with the tariffs, they hurt, they're in pain, their costs have increased. But, so let's take the example of a US steel producer, for example. So the tariffs get put in place, that helps the US steel industry. But is the US steel industry going to suddenly start building, new mills, adding extra capacity? Well, it could be a bit of a dangerous game, because what if an announcement comes out tomorrow, trade war's over, tariffs are going away. Now they've added all this extra capacity, but they don't have the protection of that tariff anymore. So on one hand, you have the firms that are hit by the tariffs, they're hurting, but then the firms that would potentially benefit, they're reticent, they're holding back. And we'll see that, talk more and more today. One of the sort of big keys is, sort of the weakness of investment. And also, China's also dealing with, political unrest in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has slipped into recession as one of the most recent countries. And then lastly, sort of, I'd take a step back for a minute. We have the United States. GDP growth. So GDP, the broadest measure of economic activity, economic production. We were running about 3% year over year a year ago. We've cooled down to 2%, which is the long-run trend potential rate for the US economy. So relative to the rest of the globe, the United States is doing pretty well as a whole. Relatively speaking, I guess is sort of the key phrase there. But I think more of the concern is the direction that things are going. It's the deceleration that, we started up at 3% a year ago, and now we're coming back down. And you can see that in this picture here, which is a bit of a mess, but we'll walk through it. What we're taking is GDP growth, the black line, and breaking it out by its different components. What's contributing to GDP growth? And looking at the black line, you can see that when the Trump administration's tax cuts came into effect, things, we got some stimulus. Growth picked up around 2018. But ever since that time, actually since mid-2018, the US economy has been slowing. What's been powering that is consumer spending. And if you actually look at that last bar right there, if you remove consumer spending, the dark blue line, GDP would have fallen last quarter. Essentially, consumption is propping things up right now. Why is that the case? First and foremost is the labor market. The labor market continues to do phenomenally well. I don't know if anyone saw the jobs number this morning. Plus 226K. That actually blows away expectations. People were nervous that it was going to be kind of a bad number. Unemployment down to 3.5%. These are unemployment rates we haven't seen in 50 years. Really fabulous labor market. That gives consumers confidence. Consumer confidence has come down a little bit because of, I think sort of, generally what's going on, trade war, Brexit. Business confidence is much lower than consumer confidence. Normally these things track pretty closely together. So it is weird that you see this divergence between consumers' expectations and businesses' expectations. As I was talking about earlier, well, they can't both be right. Someone's wrong here. I don't know if you guys are wrong or if consumers are wrong. But it makes sense when you look at the numbers. The labor market's great. Gas prices, still pretty low. Stock market, doing good. Doing well, I guess, proper grammar. Those are the things that tend to drive consumer confidence. What's my income? What's my savings? Businesses, on the other hand, have been much more impacted by the trade war, and it's contributed much more to the negative sentiment. If I want to put a little bit of like a caveat on consumption, that we shouldn't pretend that everything's perfect. If you break the consumption numbers out by income percentile, things get a little more concerning. If you look at the top 10% of income earners, they're cutting back on their spending. Their consumption's actually contracting. For the middle class, the middle bulk, the 40th to 80th percentile, they're powering consumption growth right now. They're by far leading the way, the middle class. If you look at the very bottom, the bottom 40% of the income distribution, consumption's flat. So two conclusions we can draw from this. Focusing on the high-income individuals first, they're very sensitive to financial market conditions. And this is one thing that's worrying, is that if you look at the data, the consumption of higher-earning households has become much more correlated with the stock market. So the concern is that if there's bad developments on the global front and that pulls down stocks, higher-income individuals will retrench even further. And why is that really important? Well, because the top 10% of individuals contribute 50% of consumption. On the other hand, going down to the other end of the income range, the low-income earning households, consumption's flat. That's concerning because lower-income households tend to be more sensitive to the business cycle. That they don't have a big savings buffer. They're living more paycheck to paycheck. And so any change in their job status, layoff, furlough, is much more impactful. So the fact that they're flat at the moment also indicates a little bit of pessimism on that front. What else do you notice in this picture here? Let's focus. I talked about the trade war. Let's talk about the trade war. So that's the light blue bars. Things really, I guess things sort of started to kick up, 2017, steel, aluminum tariffs. Things, really escalated with China in 2018. What do you notice about trade? Negative, 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 negative. The trade war has hurt US GDP growth. Why is that the case? Because you'd think, tariffs on imports, that should help, US companies produce more. The problem is that the US dollar is the safe haven currency of the world. So anytime people panic, they rush in and exchange their pesos for dollars, because the United States dollar is the safest currency. What that causes is the United States dollar has appreciated significantly. So the problem is that we're protecting our goods with tariffs, but the problem is the change in the exchange rate has made those goods more expensive. On net, what does that mean? This has been worse for US exporters. What else are we looking at? Investment, the green bars. Things were going pretty well through 2016, 2017. We got a little bit of a bounce in 2018 from the corporate tax cuts. The concerning thing is that, once again, that last bar, and you can barely see it, that tiny bit of green below the axes, investment contracting. So that's a source of real concern, and that's the negative sentiment that was in your survey, that we're seeing more broadly, is businesses are nervous and they're pulling back on investment. So what does this all mean? Well, it means, trade's not helping, investment's not helping. There's not much chance that, the government's going to contribute much more stimulus over the next few years. So it means it's all on consumers to carry the way. And this is why what we would say is the odds of recession are elevated. Because the economy is essentially operating on one engine. That if consumption growth falters, then this whole situation could start to unravel. If consumers get nervous and they pull back on their spending, businesses take that as a signal that things are getting worse. They cut back on investment further, they lay off workers, they cut costs. Consumers become even more worried, and you get this negative feedback loop where you possibly enter a recession. One other comment, I talked about, what are the assumptions behind our forecast? The second big assumption, as far as what's going to happen to the US trade war, our assumption is that there's no further intensification. That there are a big round of tariffs slated to go into effect on December 15th. So I guess that's only 9 days away. Nine days away is a critical juncture. What is the Trump administration going to decide to do? If they go ahead with this significant round of new tariffs, that could be enough to spark a recession. But our assumption is that the administration knows this. They know the economy has gotten weaker, and they don't have the political or the economic capital to push this kind of policy right now. So given that the president has re-election hopes, it's our expectation that he's not going to ramp up the tariffs, because that would mean stocks fall, consumers pull back, businesses pull back. So what we think is that both parties will come to some face-saving deal, and the trade war will not get any worse. Now, I'm not sure if, I think that's kind of a middle-of-the-road assumption. You're welcome to make your own, more positive or negative assumptions. If you put that all together, where is the economy headed? So we're talking about the blue dashed line here. Economic growth is going to continue to weaken. Our thinking is the second half of 2020 is kind of the critical turning point. Because at that point in time, GDP growth is down to about 1%. So we would say things are getting dangerously close to stall speed. Because the problem is when growth weakens below 2%, that creates slack in the economy, and that causes unemployment to start to rise. And if unemployment starts to rise, then you would probably see consumers start to panic. So 2020, it was particularly the second half of 2020 is going to be a crucial year. It likely also means that because the economy is going to weaken a little further, the Fed's going to cut rates one more time, probably late first half of 2020. So there'll be a little more stimulus from lower rates, but just one more cut. And after that point, things re-accelerate again in 2022, in 2021, 2022. So the key thing is there is no recession in our baseline forecast. We get close, things get a little dangerous, but we don't go into a full-blown recession. Now, these are the results produced by our global macroeconomic model. We build tons of different models to look at this in different ways. Specifically, we build what we call Probit models that actually determine what is the probability of a recession in the next 12 months. We use things like yield curves, stock prices, ISM, manufacturing indexes, try a whole bunch of different things. I won't get too much into the technical details. The bottom line is, what is the probability of a recession in the next 12 months? It's about 25–30%, about a 1 in 3 chance. So why recession in the baseline? Because you have to, the baseline is the 50-50, the middle of the road projection. So the problem is the probability of recession hasn't quite crossed that threshold where we would put it into our baseline forecast. So for now, a weak 2020, and things start to pick back up again 2021, 2022. Okay. As I said before, the key linchpin here is consumers. It is the labor market. So starting to, I guess take one step lower and look across the country, how are the different areas of the country performing? So year-over-year job growth by region. A big part of this story is demographics. The West and the South are always going to do better than the Northeast and the Midwest because their populations are just growing a lot faster. The Midwest and the Northeast kind of battle it out for last place. More recently, the Midwest is doing a lot worse than the Northeast. And the reason is because agriculture, manufacturing, and logistics transportation are cutting jobs right now. And those are really key industries, particularly manufacturing and farming and logistics, big industries in the Midwest. So the relative poorer performance of those industries is what's driving their underperformance. One thing we see is that job growth has slowed down a bit. And so it seems like a bit of the constraints, I think a while back, there was a lot of concern about being able to find, skilled workers. It seems like, at least to some degree, those constraints are becoming less binding, that job growth, even though we had a strong number today, overall trend job growth is slowing a bit. So I expect, labor constraints will start to bind a little less. But what direction are things headed? More importantly, sometimes we get concerned about, job growth and unemployment rates because we say they're lagging indicators. They kind of tell us what was happening, in the past. The leading indicator for which way is the labor market headed would be initial claims for unemployment. Sort of the best first look at, what direction the labor market's headed. Because you can see, during the last recession, you had this huge spike in unemployment claims. Of course, I'm guessing, sometimes you put up a chart, and I'm sure your attention is immediately attracted to New Jersey in late 2012, which of course was Hurricane Sandy. So you can actually see sort of the massive economic impact of that event too, this massive increase in jobless claims for unemployment. But the good news is that generally you can see that it's a little hard to decipher from this picture, but the growth rate in the number of jobless claims has been falling. It's below 0 for a considerable period of time. So that's good news. I mean, this is also, I think, helps support our view that a recession is not immediately imminent, because at least there's no telltale sign of any trouble brewing in the labor market. Things still look pretty good at the moment. So sort of what does this mean for New Jersey? The way we sort of think about forecasting regional economies is we think about what's the industrial composition of that area, and then sort of what are the macro trends affecting that industry. So of course up in northern New Jersey, it's more tied into New York City, finance, transportation and logistics, professional services. Down in the south, things tilt a little more towards leisure hospitality, tourism, things of that sort. So what it means is that, the two economies of Jersey sort of, I guess, march to the beat of different drums. That, for southern New Jersey, we're thinking about, tourism, leisure, and hospitality, much more sensitive to disposable income growth. So the fact that the labor market's really strong right now and incomes are improving is really good news for southern Jersey. Because people have that extra money to go on a vacation or take a holiday. Up in northern New Jersey, things are much more tied into the financial market. So there was a bit of a struggle, back in November or so, or back in August or so. But it seems that financial market conditions have improved. I think sort of what that's also sort of you have to take into mind is that means that the different parts of New Jersey are susceptible to different shocks. That if your business is more tied into northern New Jersey, you would be more worried about the performance of the stock market, the bond market. Where if you live in southern New Jersey, you're probably more interested in what's disposable income, how the labor market's doing. So those are the industries that exist at the moment, but the topic of discussion today is innovation. So innovation is actually really about attracting new industries and new businesses to the area. So how would you do that? Well, I think the key, the key, how do I grow new industries? How do I create new industries? The key question always is, where is the financing going to come from? Where is the investment going to come from? So we have this data on venture capital investment. So add up all the venture capital firms, where are they putting their money? Where are they investing their money? San Francisco Bay, New York City, Boston, Los Angeles. These 4 metro areas, that's where 75% of the venture capital dollars are going. And they only represent like 15% of the total US population. And then it drops off really fast after that point. So one of the hard things about attracting venture capital to New Jersey is that it is already so concentrated in particular areas. The second thing, what do all these cities have in common? This is sort of my big takeaway, my sort of analysis feeling about, innovation. What do all these places have in common? Seattle, San Diego, Austin, Philly. They're young and they're cool. That's a big part of it. Fostering innovation, what really drives that is getting younger folks to move to the area. What helps them move to the area? Top-tier universities. It's no coincidence, look at the list. San Francisco Bay Area, Stanford, Caltech, Berkeley. New York City, you have, NYU, Columbia, Boston, Harvard, MIT. Well, maybe Los Angeles and San Diego are the exception to that rule. But you still have, USC, UCLA, really great schools. So when they're great schools, young people go there, and then, if the environment's right, they choose to stay, they start businesses, you get this more entrepreneurial type of economy, and more innovation economy. So if there was one suggestion for, sort of, if I ever was to dispense policy advice, I would recommend sort of keenly thinking on, how does New Jersey utilize its strong education system with really great schools? How do we get that education system? How do we get those students that are coming to stay? You can go the extreme route of the state of Maine. If you move to the state of Maine within 5 years after graduating, they'll pay your student loans for you. If anyone's got a huge amount of student loan debt, you can move to Maine. That's the extreme case. I would not actually recommend doing that. But the point is, they're suffering a population decline. So they're desperate for thinking about, how do we stop this brain drain? How do we get younger people to come to our and stay and live in our state? It's a really key thing when you think about innovation. The other thing, Bay Area, New York City, Boston, LA, San Diego, Seattle, DC, these are extremely expensive places to live. So we have to think a little bit about cost of living, cost of doing business. Is it much ado about nothing? Does cost of business not really actually matter, because the most expensive cities in the country are the ones that are getting the most investment? Young people are moving there. The answer is a little more nuanced. So if we take those top 10 tech hubs that I listed on the previous slide, so taking just those 10 metro areas, they account for 25% of all the jobs in the country. Total jobs in those areas are 25% of the total jobs in the country. And you can see that is remarkably stable. There's a huge high concentration of high tech. So even though these cities have gotten more and more and more and more expensive to live in, expensive to do business in, high tech doesn't care. Why is that? Because high tech pays really high salaries. They're really high profit margins. So you're not as sensitive to the cost of doing business, these things. If you're in a lower margin business, and you're sort of very concerned about costs, you can see what's happening to warehousing. So this is like the big warehouses that Amazon puts up, trucking, shipping centers, things of that sort. They're leaving those cities. So that makes sense. I mean, these businesses you don't need to have your warehouse in downtown San Francisco. You can just move it 50 miles outside the city, no difference. So we do see them fleeing that area. So it's a little bit more of a nuanced answer when you think about cost of doing business, is that it definitely matters more for some industries than others. So that's sort of the baseline outlook. Now we sort of get into what could possibly go wrong. So the first thing is, let's look at the state of the US economy. Just as we classified the countries before, we're going to do a similar thing here where we classify the metro areas in the United States according to what stage of the business cycle they're in. So the good news is you see a lot of green up here. You actually see a lot of green in the New Jersey, Mid-Atlantic area too. Actually a whole sort of strong corridor of growth in the Northeast. So the economy is doing very well. Where do you see the weakness? It's in like the Midwest, those manufacturing areas. What you don't see here is, of course, all that white space, all those rural areas. That's actually sort of where most of the economic pain is at the moment. The cities aren't big enough to show up on this map. If we look at the share of metro areas that are in green, so what share of metros are in this nice green expansion state? Well, it's up around 70%, which I think is also a reason people get into this fear of recession. Yeah, it's like, oh, this is as good as it gets. Oh, the end must be near. Oh, this expansion's been going on for 10 years. It must be getting old. Well, one truth of economics is expansions don't die of old age. And one point I want to make clear is, as you can see back in the 1990s, this share was very high for very long. And sort of one of the things that's also not obvious from this picture is if you look down on the bottom, the recovery from the last recession was very slow. You can see how long it takes for this blue line to finally start increasing. That's the share of metro areas in late cycle expansion. So one of the hopes is that because the recovery took so long, we may want to think about this idea of like age or how old the recovery is. Another thing we've been looking at is, like I said, it didn't quite come out, I guess it got squished. This is one of the features on our website. I'd recommend economy.com, great site. What we do is we sort of plot this matrix of all the risks that the economy faces. In terms of, on the horizontal axis, how severe would that shock be? Versus on the vertical axis, what's the likelihood that that shock actually takes place? So you can see, up in the top left corner, the manufacturing industry is in recession. So there's a very high likelihood that, since it is, going to be. But in terms of like the spillover to the rest of the economy, in terms of the shock properties, it's not that severe. Really, above and beyond all else, the escalation in the trade war is the most serious threat to the economy. As I said, if the Trump administration goes through with the massive new round of tariffs on December 15th, it would very likely tilt the scales and put the economy into recession. We've run those scenarios. So we've used our models to try to say, like, how bad would it be? And I guess at least the good news is that it's nothing like the Great Recession. It's nothing that severe. It would be what we, sort of an average-sized recession. Something similar to, the dot-com bust of 1999, 2000 or so. In terms of, what should New Jersey be caring about? It's the financial risks, liquidity crisis. So we know the Fed has intervened in the repo market. I'm not going to really, I probably don't have the time to go into that today. The point being is that there's trouble spots in the financial market, particularly in repo, where what we call, sort of non-bank lenders get their financing. Leveraged loans, stock market correction, these are the risks that should be on the minds of New Jersey businesses. Oh, I don't know what that is. Oh. So this is what happens when you use someone else's slide deck. All the ones in red are the ones that New Jersey should be cared about. I was wondering where those were. There we are. And even negative US interest rate. I talked about negative rates before. There's disagreement among economists about if bringing rates even lower would even work. It's not obvious, because the Fed stimulates economy by cutting rates, but what happens when they cut rates and they hit zero? Do they go negative? Do they just keep going? The evidence is mixed about whether or not that's even a good idea. As I said before, this is just reinforcing the point that the New Jersey economy is so closely tied to the performance of the financial industry. Second most, though, you also have to think about the spillover. It's not just that New Jersey has a high share of jobs in finance. It's that all of New Jersey's neighbors also have a high share of jobs in finance. So there's also not just New Jersey get hit, there's also your neighbors' economies weaken, and that spills over, and then everyone's in the same boat. Also underscores, why was the last recession so particularly painful in New Jersey? Why did New Jersey's recovery take so long? It's because it was a financial crisis. There are different types of recessions, financial crisis being one of them, and that's typically you would think the worst kind of recession for New Jersey. What about the trade war? The good news, I guess, is that New Jersey has a lot less exposure to the trade war with China than the rest of the United States. So I guess that's a bit of a positive, a bit of a silver lining. I mean, it's hard to just sort of decipher from this picture, but where do you see the pain? It's in the Midwest, it's in the Plain States, it's in agriculture, it's in manufacturing. It is in those products that the United States exports. Less so in New Jersey. New Jersey tends to be more connected, more trade partner with Canada, the European Union. New Jersey does better in a Chinese trade war, but I think New Jersey has a little bit exposure to if the Brexit situation goes poorly, because of the way it affects financial markets, because it would be particularly hurtful for New Jersey trade. Now this question comes up a lot. This has been in the news lately. Consumers in America have a record high level of debt. It's the highest it's ever been. It's over $1 trillion. It's $1.15 trillion. Or no, I take that, no, I'm reading the wrong axis. $13 trillion in debt in the United States, higher than the previous recession. Well, don't panic. Debt per household is a lot lower today, about $80,000, than it was during the lead up to the last recession. So part of the reason that made the last recession so painful and so long-lasting was because consumers went in with these higher debt loads. But essentially, consumers learned sort of the once bitten, twice shy. Consumer savings rates are around 8%. Consumer debt loads the consumer's balance sheets are looking really healthy. So consumer debt is not something we're worried about. And really, all that matters at the end of the day is debt service. It's not what the total principal on your mortgage is. The real question for consumers is, what's my monthly payment? That's what affects your behavior. And the good news is that debt service, which is your payments as a share of your income, is pretty healthy in most areas, and it's actually particularly healthy in New Jersey. It's the lower income South which appears to have the most problems. And so I'm sorry to move a little fast, but I want to get to sort of the last big question of what can we do for the next recession? If the recession comes, are we prepared? So the good news is that, for the country as a whole, states have gone a long way towards improving their rainy day funds. You see that, rainy day funds as a share of expenditures are much higher than they were before. Because there's sort of this issue, the federal government's kind of in a bind as far as providing stimulus. Interest rates are already really low. The federal government's running a deficit of $1 trillion a year. So, the states aren't going to get a lot of support from the federal government. But, at Moody's we did this nice analysis looking state by state. And one of the big issues is that New Jersey is not prepared for the next recession. And here's how we arrive at this analysis. The first being is that, when the recession hits, your revenues go down. The problem is investment income is more cyclical, so incomes drop more in New Jersey than they would elsewhere. The second, expenditures. Spending on programs for, things like Medicaid or food stamps or things of that sort. The problem is New Jersey is a high income state, so it gets less help from the federal government for those programs. And then the last issue is that New Jersey's pension system is underfunded. Assets to liability ratio, like 57%. It is one of the worst in the country, as opposed to like a 72% national average. So the problem is, even when things are going bad, revenues are down, your other expenses are up, you're also, you need to make up some payments on the pension system, which also puts your state in a bind. So the overall final analysis is, the good news is we don't think we're headed for a recession, but the bad news is that if it comes, it doesn't seem like New Jersey's very well prepared. So sorry, economics is the dismal science. I have to end it on a bad note. But I'll stop there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions.